Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. So it's time to fit the roll hoops. We've got the body mounted to the chassis, and this is probably the scariest part of the build so far for me. Don't want to get these wrong at all. It'd be very, very visible. So let's take a look how we got through that process. I'm Roy Farr, and this is my build of a Gardner Douglas 427 Mark IV. So let's talk about fitting these roll hoops. I've actually already done them now, so I'm recording this afterwards. Frankly, they were too stressful and too painful to put in place. Painful, actually literally. As some of the GD owners will know, I was under the car the other day, turned around and smacked my head on the corner of a lift under the car. Actually cut my head open and I had blood streaming down my face for a good couple of minutes before it all stopped, thankfully, and thankfully no concussion or stitches needed. But what an idiot. Turned around under the car and just caught my head on something. It should have been protected. So anybody starting one of these sorts of builds or anything like that, health and safety guys, just get out there and make sure things in the garage are safe. This was just a corner piece of steel. It was exposed and it probably should have something protective on it. So that's my bad. Anyway, so let's have a look around and I'll tell you how I managed to fit these roll hoops. So here are the 3 holes that we needed for the roll hoops on each side. And the challenge with these is that the roll hoops bolt in from under the car. There are 3 points on the chassis, and that's where the roll hoops need to connect to. But of course, to get the roll hoops through the body and to connect to the chassis, not only have you got to drill holes in the top, you've also got to drill holes in the underside of the floor in the bottom of the car, so that they go through the top of the car, the rear deck and the floor, and then they connect with the chassis underneath. So you actually have to think about planning the whole thing in reverse. Now, how do you get the holes right in the bottom first? So there are 2 ways of doing this, as I understand it, and I opted for the second way. The first way is to have your car leveled in terms of the body and chassis. Actually, I should say that first. The body needs to be fitted to the chassis. You can't do this with the body off the chassis. For obvious reasons, you're going to need to connect the roll hoops to the chassis. So it needs to be set and mounted. As you can see with this here at the moment, come down in the front here, there's one of the chassis bolts, and there's another one down there, and there's a third one down there, and there's another couple under the car, including a couple in the engine bay. So once all the car's bolted down, ideally you want it as level as possible, but here's the rub. My garage has got about a 3 degree to 4 degree incline, and it's not straight horizontally either. So trying to get the car level is an absolute pig. I know some people have dropped it down onto the tyres and they've let tyre pressures out, and that gets you sort of roughly there. But frankly, I just didn't want to try and sort that out because I've tried it before and it's a nightmare. So there is another way of doing this, and I haven't got this on the video because I actually took a picture of it briefly whilst I was doing it, so let me just try and explain. There are the 3 holes that we needed to cut in order to get the roll hoops through to the chassis underneath. Now the first thing you've got to do is actually orient where those holes are under the body. So the way we chose to do this, we got the car up on a lift and we marked through the floor from the chassis underneath, so under those 3 points, and we marked up using, frankly, a really, really long drill bit extension, so I could get all the way through the various gaps in the chassis with the drill sitting out the bottom. It's probably a good 45 centimetres long. Created a small hole up in the centre of each of those to get your centre point. Made that hole big enough to put a piece of M12 bar, threaded bar through. And the idea with that was that if we could get that bar mounted flush onto the base of the chassis, then if that bar was straight and flush enough, we could mark that all the way up to the top and then mark where the hole should be on the top. Now, if the car is level, you can do this with a plumb bob. So where you know where these holes are, you can put a plumb bob up the top, hang them down, and where the bob sits, that's where the hole would need to be on the top, because then you've made sure it's directly above the hole that you're drilling to. Can't do that if the car's not level, of course. It'll be all over the place. So, threaded bar up to the top, and I'll show you the picture of that in a second, and then you get an idea of where it can be on the top. Then the best thing you do is you come around and then you drill a pilot hole through from the top to get the first hole and make sure that it's lining up against that M12 studded bar. I found on the left a piece of 350mm bar was perfect. And for the centre one here, where actually the curvature of the deck is a little bit higher, 400mm was perfect. I think I got them for £10 for a couple of them off of Amazon, so piece of cake there. So then coming back round on the top here, with the M12 bar through a small hole, cutting the boot, you can then find where the centre of that bar is, and hopefully you've got it in the right place, you're right over the top. If you haven't, then you need to open that hole out slightly so you're sitting over the top of that M12 bolt. Now, the advice I saw from another builder was to drill a 6mm hole in the top of that M12 bolt. Then you can put your circle cutter on the top, get that in the right place, and then your circle cutter should be in the right place to spin that circle, get the first hole through, and then you can start test fitting the roll hoops. And actually I'm pointing to this one, this is completely wrong. You'd be cutting these two holes first. Do not look at the back one first. The first two holes you cut are these two. So you cut these first, and the suggestion is to start with a hole cutter the size of the roll hoops, which from memory was 53mm, and then you open this out with a small sander, a sanding drum, and then you literally only open it enough just so you can get the roll hoops through the top holes and through the bottom holes. So 53mm here and here. The back roll hoop is 38mm, but again, once you've cut 38, you do need to sand it open a little bit more. And the trick is actually cut the first two holes, drill those first, put the roll hoops in, but put them backwards. So the third leg hangs over this way into the boot. Then you can get those in, and the next thing is, if I again cut to another picture that I'll show you, you have a jig that you can make that fits all the way up the roll hoops, but you turn it round back to front. So the third leg sits into the cockpit there, and your jig then shows you over here where that third hole needs to be. And hopefully where you've got your studding up and you've drilled your pilot hole, again you can eyeball it to make sure that you're in the right place, and anything else, double check, triple check, make sure you've got all of that correct. So with all of that going on, the first set I cut were over that side, and I have to say I think I got one of the holes ever so slightly too big, but the grommets, rubber grommets, and the aluminium surrounds that sit over the top, they cover all of that nicely. So whilst it sounds really scary, if you take your time, measure, try, and keep going back and forth, it's actually not too bad. So that's how that ended up. So this is how one of the roll hoops looks when it's test fitted. See at the front there, just placed through the holes, no rubber grommet or anything, but on this back one here, that rear leg, rubber grommet and the aluminium finisher, which will end up being just bolted through the top. And the last thing I'll say about those roll hoops is the chassis I have here, it's a GD Euro. It's not an ADV, it's the last GD Euro that Andy had, but really the only difference is the uprights and the suspension design, but to all intents and purposes it's the same as an ADV, so GD Euro. The centres for the two biggest roll hoop legs, the two at the front, on the chassis, on my chassis, do check yours if you're doing the same again, but on my chassis were 30 centimetres apart, or 300mm. But when you measure the legs of the roll hoops themselves, there's always going to be a bit of manufacturing tolerance in them. So actually one set of legs were 30.5 and the other set were 29.5. So they were both out, one needed pulling out slightly, one needed compressing. There's a couple of schools of thought. You could try and open those up forcefully, clamps or something else to push them out and try and correct them to get them to 30 centimetres. It's quite difficult because you could go too far, but they're very strong. Or the alternative is to simply fit them in the car, and then when you get them in broadly the right place, you use clamps or wedges or a piece of wood to go between and stretch the legs or compress them, and then you can get them lined up and get the bolts in. This was particularly stressful. It took a long time to get that bit right, but eventually we got there. And frankly, once they're in, they look absolutely awesome. I mean, anybody who's building one of these cars, once you get those roll hoops in, there's all sorts of things that make the car look more like a car every time, but those roll hoops going in, it's such a dream. So they're absolutely delightful. Let's leave it there. Cool. Thank goodness that's all over. Look at the state of all of that. All those bits and pieces of fiberglass cut through the body. At least that job is done, thank goodness. Where are we off to next? Time to start looking at fitting the windscreen. No time to wait, we've got to get this body off to paint soon. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.